Good day. I've been asked to introduce myself to you and give you some background on my involvement in the 518 democracy movement, or as it was originally known, or initially known as the Gwangju Sate. Been trying to keep this talk very similar to the paper that I presented, and you have all had a chance to see. But I can't guarantee I'll be able to do that because just for the same reason that I was willing to stay in Gwangju in 518, I have a tendency to sort of go off topic when I need to. So I'm an American. My name's David Lee Dollinger. My Korean name is Im Dae-woon, and I'm actually very proud of that name. I was known by that name from 78 until 81 when I left Korea to pursue my graduate career. And I was initially in Korea because I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I was working in a tuberculosis center in the town of Yeongam, which is about an hour and a half, hour 45 minutes southwest of Gwangju in the county of Yeongam. And when I first showed up in Yeongam in 1978 in August, probably you could say I had a very minimal knowledge of Korean, but I was able to survive. And in the intervening time, I was able to actually become very proficient in the language. So Gwangju was the provincial capital for Jeollanam-do, where I lived, and it was a place where a lot of times Peace Corps volunteers would meet on weekends to meet one another, to talk, be able to talk English, be able to interact with what they considered to be knowns. Um, I did not spend a lot of time initially in Gwangju. I really didn't have a lot of desire to meet other Peace Corps volunteers. I really enjoyed the Korean countryside. I loved the town where I lived. I love Wulchersan, which was the mountains that were just at the edge of my town. And so I spent a lot of time there. But occasionally I would go into Gwangju. And in Gwangju, I spent more of my time either investigating the culture and temples in nearby mountains rather than really finding Peace Corps volunteers. But I did start to develop friendships with Koreans that lived in Gwangju. Mainly, they were college students. A lot of times they wanted to practice English, but a lot of times they also wanted to sort of understand what my perception was of what was going on in Korea at the time. So let me sort of preface a little bit of my involvement and my bearing witness. Just so you know, I was raised as a Quaker, and so I'm a nonviolent. I've always been raised as being nonviolent, but always being someone that was aware of human rights, that was concerned about about the people around them. Now, in some ways, when I look back to 518, to me, it almost is a series of fates that sort of brought me there. I'm things that had never occurred to me the entire time that I had previously been living in Korea occurred around that point in time. And to me, it all drove me to Gwangju. So I originally was in Gwangju on the 16th or the 15th, which is Friday. Um, what was interesting is I finished my work at the health center, which was at about 5 p.m. Jumped on the bus with a backpack full of change of clothes, and then headed towards Gwangju. Part of the one of the stops on that bus trip was through Naju. In Naju, I actually met a friend of mine. She was a nurse at the health center there, and so she sat down with me. We talked as we went into Gwangju, decided we'd have dinner together. Before that, we went to her brother's apartment so she could drop off her stuff because that was where she was going to be staying. Her brother was a junior at Cheonnam University. And when we got there, he was talking very intimately with a number of other students. There were about three other students that he was talking about, and they were talking about what had been occurring in Korea the previous week, and the fact that the universities and the students had decided that they would stop protesting, that they would go back to the campuses because this is what had been asked of them by the government so that democratic processes could start to take place. They let me know about the candlelight march that was going to occur that night. And because of that, I was able to witness that candlelight march as they marched from the train station towards the provincial office building. Now, the reason that I was actually in Gwangju was really one of convenience. I had to go to a wedding that was occurring on Saturday, the 16th. So headed out early on Saturday to that wedding. Had a beautiful time. It was a Peace Corps volunteer who was marrying another Korean person that he had met, and met a number of Peace Corps volunteers there. We had a really great time. The wedding was beautiful. But on Sunday, the 18th, we woke up to the news that martial law had been declared. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what did this really mean, because I was able to contribute the fact that I had heard from the university students, really what was going on, that they had decided to go back to their campuses to study, to allow a democratic process to take place. So it almost had appeared to us in our looking at the situation that the government had duped them and that this was all had been pre-planned. So Sunday, in the early afternoon, I then headed back to Gwangju. And as we were getting close to the bus terminal, you could start to smell the tear gas in the air. And when we got off the bus, the terminal was just crowded a lot more than normal, with lots of people really running around, people yelling and screaming. And this was all because curfew had been put in place, buses were shut down. So because of that, I was not able to catch the last bus to Yong'an. And so I decided I was going to have to spend the night in Gwangju, and I would leave the next morning. Now, there was this area in Gwangju where a lot of us used to stay, Peace Corps volunteers. It was down near the provincial office buildings. So I started walking from the bus terminal to the provincial office buildings, taking my normal back alley route. And what was really funny about that is, just out of fate, I was able to meet Tim Warnberg, another volunteer. He was the same group that I was, K45. He lived in Gwangju and was a leprosy control worker. And I can assure you, in the previous almost 2 years that I had been wandering around Gwangju, I had never met Tim accidentally on the streets. When Tim and I met, I asked him if he could fill me in on what was going on. He could. He had been downtown when all of this had started, when all the initial protests and demonstrations had taken place. So as we sort of walked down Kumnam, the main thoroughfare towards the provincial office building, he started to fill me in on what had happened. And as we walked, you could see the troops in the side streets, just sitting in their trucks or standing around their trucks, just in a lot of ways being intimidating. You also noticed that Koreans that were on the streets were moving very rapidly, all with an intended purpose, most of which was really to get home. So Tim talked about what he had seen, how the demonstrations had started. And at one point, we were where there was construction going on down for the new underground in Gwangju. And he was telling me that, the students had come out of this direction. This construction site was where they had armed themselves with some rocks and stones. And as he's talking to me about this, an old man who was a halabuji, dressed in hanbok, had to have been in his 70s, beautiful white hair and beard, came running over towards us. And I have to say, it was running. It was not just a walk. He came over to us as rapidly as he could and immediately started firing questions at us in Korean. Had we seen what occurred? Do we know what was happening? And Tim and I were saying, yeah. Well, Tim was telling him he had seen what happened. I was like, I know what Tim has been telling me, what has happened. And he just sat there and he said, the citizens of Gwangju can't be treated this way. That they have to resist and they have to fight back. And then he just left with that statement, sort of prefacing what was to occur. So early on Monday, I headed back to my health center and worked there for 3 days. Well, 2 days. On Wednesday morning, I was supposed to actually go to an in-service training. So I had to go through Gwangju to go to Seoul to then to go to the in-service training. Even knowing what had going on, because we were constantly hearing rumors and being given information that were from people that were coming from Gwangju while we were in the health center, I decided I was going to keep on going, that I would go to Gwangju. I was really concerned about Tim, who I knew who lived there. I was concerned about my Korean friends, and I really didn't care if I ever made it to Seoul. I knew I had to actually go to Gwangju. So I jumped on the first bus that I could get, and that took me as far as Naju. Naju, the bus driver said for everyone to get off the bus. He was going no further. So, being in a little pickle, I got off the bus, started asking around, had taxi drivers offer to drive me to Gwangju for the equivalent of $100. And being the Peace Corps volunteer that I was and having very little money, I decided I can walk. I know the route. I've taken this bus multiple times. I'll just follow the bus route into Gwangju and there won't be an issue. So off I went. Now, the original route that the bus took from Gwangju to Naju, there was a section of highway that was greatly expanded to be an emergency landing field for aircraft, just in the case of there being a war happening. Now, I just started going down that section of highway when I saw coming at me a taxi, a truck, and a bus. There were banners on the trucks and the buses. People were sticking their heads out the windows of the bus. And so, being sort of maybe the naive young man that I was, I pulled my camera out and I took a picture. Immediately, the taxi, which had been leading the procession of vehicles, whipped around and came and stopped right in front of me. I didn't even have a chance to get my camera back into my bag when they had stopped. And immediately this man in the back seat starts screaming and yelling at me in Korean to give me my camera, to give him my camera. And of course, being as calm as I could, I told him I would not do that, that he had no right to my camera. This went on for a little bit, a couple of different exchanges. Finally, out of nowhere, the driver speaks in perfect English and tells me he doesn't want your camera. He just wants the film. So please just give him the film. And I answered him back in Korean, I'm sorry, I can't. I want to see his identification card. And then the driver goes, well, he's KCIA. I go, well, then I need to see his identification card. I want to get his national identification number so I can take it down. That went on a couple of different times. The gentleman in the back started to get very, very angry. Suddenly, he thrust himself out the back window with a truncheon, which was about a 2x2 piece of wood, about 4 to 5 feet long, and stabbed it at my chest. Luckily, I didn't move, didn't take a step back, step forward, didn't blink. I just slowly looked down, saw that it was about 2 or 3 centimeters from my sternum, and then looked him straight in the eye and said, I cannot give you my camera, and I will not give you my camera. With that, he started screaming at the driver to get out of here, and then they took off. What was interesting about all of this is an older Korean woman had been walking down the road towards us when this was all occurring. And she came up to me and she goes, are you crazy? She watched all of it and heard all the exchanges. And she just looked at me and said, are you crazy? You never do that to KCIA. Give them whatever they want. Do not stand up to them. And I told her, I said, I can't do that. That's not right. They have no right to do this. So with that, I continued my walk into Gwangju. Took a shortcut through the rice fields because I thought it might be a little bit safer to stay off the roads. And as I was starting to crest the hill into Gwangju, I met my friend from the Naju Health Center again. She was walking out. She was headed back to Naju. And once she met me and found out that I was walking into Gwangju and that I wanted to observe and witness what was happening, she turned around and walked in to the city with me. Now, as we were walking in, she was giving me a little bit of highlights of what she had been observing about what was going on about with the demonstrations around Kumnamro. As we were starting to head down towards Kumnamro, we met a young man and who was driving a Jeep around that actually had a body on that was stopping in neighborhoods and telling the citizens what was going on and the brutality that had been occurring and that their citizens of Gwangju were dying. Just shortly after that, we continued our walk, and all of a sudden we heard a helicopter, and I just watched everyone scatter around me and head for indoors. And me, again, being sort of that stupid, naive American, looked up at the helicopter. The next thing I know, my friend grabbed me by the arm and was dragging me into a store and saying, "Are you crazy?" And I'm like, "Why? What's the problem?" And then I heard what the problem was. And I peered out through the door of the store and can see soldiers shooting down in towards Kumnamro from the helicopters. So later that day, I went to find Tim. Tim was not at home. I was told by the mother of the family that he was living with that he was expected back. So I headed out again. Went back towards Kumnamro and again started to peer down Kumnamro when I was grabbed and told, "Are you stupid?" And I'm like, "Why? What's the problem?" And they're like, "They're shooting anyone that sticks their head out. So don't do it." So finally sort of figuring out what was in some ways going on in Gwangju. Was also at that point in time, I was still at that point in time taking photos. And immediately after taking a photo of the protesters against the wall of the building, one of them came over and said, "Can you please stop that?" And I'm like, "Why? What's the problem?" He goes, "Well, the photos from the Masa and Busan uh, demonstrations earlier in the year have been taken from reporters and were being utilized to identify who the protesters were so that they could be arrested." So with that, I told him I would no longer take pictures of demonstrators, that I had to respect their anonymity. So as we sort of go on, I was able to meet Tim that evening. On Thursday, that's when I refused to leave Gwangju officially to the U.S. Embassy. There's a lot of stories we could tell you. The biggest one, though, that people sort of want to understand was actually Saturday. So Saturday, I met a lot of the leaders, the student leaders, the young leaders in the dojon, in the provincial office building. I was actually given a pass that gave me free access to the entire provincial office buildings. I was asked to sit in and participate in some of the meetings that are occurring among the citizens committees. I was then also asked on Saturday if I could please spend the night in the provincial office buildings and listen to the military radio that they had, because they thought that perhaps the military was going to speak in English to announce the attack on the city. So I spent the night in the provincial office buildings, met a lot of the unfortunate people that did not make it, that were willing to sacrifice themselves. And really, you all sort of know what happened on Tuesday. On Tuesday, the 27th, at about 3:30, we were awakened by the sole voice of a woman telling us that the troops were attacking. Please come out and help protect the city. Probably that's one of my biggest regrets is I actually did propose to Tim at that time that we go and we sit in front of the provincial office buildings, that perhaps we could alleviate some of the brutality and the violence that we knew was going to occur. I think in possibly better wisdom, he talked me out of that. For what I did, or what was perceived that I did in Gwangju, I was forced to leave the Peace Corps. I do not believe that I violated any of the Peace Corps' rules and regulations. I was not there making a political statement. I was there because I cared about the citizens of Gwangju. And since that time, even after I came back, I stayed active. I was active through the 90s with different groups that were still focused on democracy in Korea and human rights in Korea and getting the truth out about Gwangju. Thank you.